Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, prescription drugs. They cost so much because drug companies shell out huge sums on research and development, right? Wrong, says Merrill Goozner, author of the $800 million pill. Pills for every want, even to fool us about aging. Spoken word artist Chris Chandler travels to St. Augustine and finds out what the Fountain of Youth is really all about. Plus, call him Mr. Curator. Ethelbert Miller takes us on a tour of All the Stories Are True African American Writers Speak at the Anacostia Museum.
A great story has to be first enthralling, captivating, has to make you want to trade your everyday life. And then second has to keep your attention.
From the archives, New York Times correspondent Christopher Marquis chats about journalism and fiction, biological and found families, and his first novel, A Hole in the Heart, poetry by Lisa Pegram, and music by Rick and Audrey. Welcome to the forum at the Coffee House. Especially because it's an election year, expect to hear a lot about the ballooning price of prescription drugs. The drug industry maintains its pricing reflects real costs, plus a fair rate of return on risky investments. Well, over the last decade, drug industry profits zoomed up 318%, more than double the rate of the S&P index. But last year was a downer for the drug makers, their stocks trailing the S&P by 18%. Why are investors suddenly skittish? Fortune magazine notes that patents on big blockbuster drugs will soon expire, which means the giant pharmaceutical companies will lose market share to low-priced generic brands. Yet, to keep new drugs in the pipeline, the big pharmaceuticals must pump huge sums into research and development. $800 million for each new drug that comes to market. $800 million. Now, where did Fortune come up with this figure? Well, a new book, The $800 Million Pill, argues that drug makers are actually spending only a fraction of that amount on R&D. In fact, author Merrill Goozner makes the case that we taxpayers are carrying the financial load in bringing new drugs to the market and then paying rip-off prices on the back end at the drugstore. Merrill Goozner is the former chief economics correspondent for the Chicago Tribune and the winner of 6 Peter Lisagor Awards for exemplary journalism. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
$800 million. Where did that figure come from?
It actually comes from a study conducted at Tufts University, paid for by the pharmaceutical industry, in which they did a lot of financial manipulations and it came up with this, what I consider to be an overinflated figure. We could go through the math of that, but I think the essence of the argument is that a lot of what the drug industry spends on research and development is actually what I would categorize as corporate waste. They're spending it on drugs to replace drugs coming off patent that really add nothing to physicians' armamentarium for fighting disease. They are coming up with drugs that are new entries in a class that already have 5 and 6 and 7 other drugs already out there to do the very same thing, just so that that particular company has an entry to compete in that marketplace. And as a result, what you have is a crowded pharmaceutical marketplace that is actually showing less and less innovation for the amount of money that is being raised from consumers, because it is consumers who actually pay for this as part of the cost of drugs, which are getting ever higher. And at the same time, we are getting less innovation for those dollars.
You make the case that the taxpayer is bearing the lion's share of the burden for new drug development. Explain what the role of the taxpayer is.
Well, if you understand that about half of what they do is what I just described as waste,
they being the
pharmaceutical companies, then you have to admit that, of course, the actual development of drugs is their business. And when a new therapy comes along, the other half of their business, if you will, that actually does improve our weapons for fighting disease, that they are part of the innovation process. But they are actually the second half of the process. The first half and most creative steps of the innovation process really are 2 steps. One is the identification of targets, understanding the biology of a disease state so that it can be tackled pharmaceutically. And then coming up with potential molecules, possible biotechnology products, traditional medicinal chemistry drugs that can actually affect that disease. And when you look at case after case, which I do in the book, what you find really is that much of that research, indeed I would say most of that research, that early, most creative steps of the innovation process take place in the public sector, funded by taxpayers, at the National Institutes of Health, or at universities around the country, not-for-profit institutes, dedicated researchers whose mind are really focused on solving the problem of disease. It's when that group comes up with a potential solution that is when the pharmaceutical industry then steps in to help develop that to take it to the marketplace. It's not that the drug companies are irrelevant to the process, but it's only when we've actually had the scientific breakthroughs, which are rare,
well, let's talk
that
about
enable us, for the drug industry to step in and develop a drug.
One of the great successes in recent years is drug therapy for HIV/AIDS. Back in 1983 it was, I believe, we were just beginning to recognize AIDS as a disease. And here we are 21 years later, and at least for those who can afford it, in the developed world there is now a therapy of a cocktail that enables one to live with AIDS. How did we do that?
Well, it's a fascinating story. It takes up a large chunk of the book. AIDS really represents in many ways the greatest success of pharmaceutical innovation in the last quarter of the 20th century. A great new plague arises on the scene, killing tens of thousands of people here in the United States per year, around the world now killing millions of people per year. And over from the United States, you've got to remember the Reagan administration was very slow to react to this. It was only pressure from people with AIDS, holding protests and demonstrations that forced the government to take this plague seriously. But when they got involved, the United States between about 1985 and 1996, when the triple cocktail emerged as a successful therapy, the U.S. government spent about $10 billion total in AIDS research. The whole pharmaceutical industry combined only spent about $3 billion in that period of time. All of the earliest drugs were identified and brought through all the way through clinical trials to development and acceptance by the Food and Drug Administration as a therapy that could be used were all done by NIH scientists. Sometimes drug companies actually owned the drugs, but it was government-funded scientists who went into the drug company, got the drugs from them, tested them in NIH labs, and actually did the development process. In those days, the drug companies didn't want to touch it. They were as scared as the average Americans of what might possibly happen to their researchers from this unknown bug. And so it was the second phase of that when they were developing, what they quickly learned when they developed the first 2 or 3 drugs for AIDS is that people quickly developed resistance. And so they realized that they were going to have to come up with new drugs. So once again, the government stepped in. They had a directed research program, a sort of Manhattan Project, to develop drugs. They actually gave grants out to industry and to a number of academic researchers. They developed a new class of drugs called protease inhibitors, which became, when they finally were approved, the third drug, which when you treated it with 3 different drugs, they finally got a combination that could keep the disease under control. And as I pointed out, the drug industry was definitely involved, but the point is that the government played an overwhelming role in bringing all of those drugs to market when you look at the whole process in
today, you say that the drug industry spent a total of $3 billion in the development.
This is pre-approval, 96.
And how much money are the 3 pharmaceutical companies, Hoffman La Roche, Abbott, and Merck, earning per year now on AIDS drugs?
Interesting question. Actually, there's many more companies now in the market. There's actually about 17 or 18 AIDS drugs out there. So other companies came up with similar drugs in those classes, which is actually needed in AIDS therapy because people develop resistance to other drugs, some of the drugs that are out there, sometimes especially if you had started early on. But the point is that once you had a successful therapy, the prices that they were charging, which ranged from $10,000 to $15,000 a year, turned AIDS therapy into what today is, I believe, about a $7 billion a year market. So what you're seeing is that the research and development that goes into AIDS, and there's continuing research and development, which may be in the range of $1 billion a year, or that much across all of industry, but they're generating 7 times that amount of cash flow from that sales, and they probably made all of their R&D costs back in the first 1 or 2 years. But you know, the funny thing about R&D is you really shouldn't look at it as an investment. The important thing to remember about research and development in the private sector is that it's actually a cost that they spend every year, so that current drug consumers pay for current research and development expenses. So I sort of reject their logic that this is any kind of investment at all. They've earned it back. You know, the only way they don't earn it back is if a program totally fails. In this case, because there was a concerted attempt, you know, on the part of thousands of researchers on 3 different continents, they came up with a successful therapy, and it became a very successful market as a result.
You mentioned before that it was only pressure from AIDS victims that pushed the Reagan administration and the U.S. government to really get into finding a cure or a treatment for AIDS. I'm wondering, and since that time there have been evolved for other diseases similar kinds of efforts to focus on a particular disease, yet I'm wondering for diseases that don't have a first world constituency, like tuberculosis or malaria or other diseases that are real big killers in the developing world, what happens to people suffering those diseases, and are they going to be completely forgotten in the drug research process if citizens can influence the scientific research process like this?
Well, you're raising a very important point, which is that there's 2 reasons why the drug industry, the pharmaceutical companies, will not tackle a disease. And they're basically the same issue. One is if there are so few people who have the disease that you would have to, in order to generate any kind of real revenue from, if you came up with a successful therapy, you'd have to charge a tremendous amount of money per patient. The other problem, which is the inverse of it, is that if you have millions upon millions of people all over the globe who suffer from a disease, and you mentioned 2 of the worst, which is malaria, which all the old drugs are becoming ineffective, and also drug-resistant tuberculosis is basically the same thing. These are killers for which we once had solutions, and now we need new drugs because of the rise of drug-resistant strains. And of course, you can have millions of people all over the globe, but if between all of them they've got 10 cents per person, you know, in terms of disposable income, you also have no market, really, and there's no interest for that. And as a result, you don't have the research and development from the private sector. Could the public sector have a directed research campaign? Absolutely they could. Except the problem is that kind of sophisticated research is really a skill that exists, again, in the advanced industrial world. So you have to ask yourself, is there a political will in the United States, or for that matter in Western Europe or Japan, which is the other major research centers in the world for advanced pharmaceuticals? You have to say, do they have the will to tackle these diseases? You can ask yourself, in the United States government, we spend about $200 million a year on both of those diseases. NIH has a $27 billion a year budget. It's a drop in the bucket. When you realize, I said...
Very quickly, I got to ask you, because we're about out of time.
Okay.
What should we be doing about the high prices of drugs?
Well, I think that we don't have to worry about keeping the prices high in order to fund innovation, I think, this discussion. If we understand that, then what the government can do is that it can have a Medicare benefit, or it can help, or for that matter, insurance companies can negotiate lower prices with the drug companies without fear of choking off innovation. In fact, if we were to do things like have comparative clinical trials and help people buy the most cost-effective drugs that are out there, meaning if you know generics are better, you go buy generics, that what would happen is that the pharmaceutical industry would be forced to spend its scarcer dollars on legitimate innovation rather than going after drugs that do nothing but replicate drugs that are already out there because there's already a proven high-priced market.
Many thanks to Merrill Goozner for this important book, The $800 Million Pill. And thanks as well to the heroic scientists who've dedicated their careers to eradicating the great scourges that still afflict us. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
It was somewhere between the beginning of time and the end of time. Okay, it was a little closer to the end of time, but I can't really say for sure. Because you see, I have been to St. Augustine, Florida. I have. And I drank from the Fountain of Youth. I did. I stood in line for over an hour, and I paid $11 for the experience. And that was with the AAA discount. Now, the water from the Fountain of Youth was served to me in a disposable cup by a well-tanned teenager in a red and gold conquistador outfit. I didn't think about it much until later that afternoon. I was at my friend's place in the suburbs, and we were sitting around his swimming pool, and there was that same kid, still wearing the red and gold conquistador outfit, sunning himself in the water. He was held afloat by a life-sized inflatable alligator, its tail wrapped around one side of him and its mouth around the other, and in its snout was a yellow beer koozie maintaining an ice-cold Corona. Now, this kid seemed to be one of those people who never gets off work, as if he actually enjoyed being employed by the Chamber of Commerce, or maybe he had posted his list of hobbies to one of those online job searches and it matched him up with the red and gold conquistador outfit. He said, "This is what I want to do with the rest of my life. Welcome to St. Augustine," he said, "the oldest city in the Western Hemisphere. Why, it was here that Ponce de Leon and I searched for the Fountain of Youth. I was only 19 years old at the time." This kid's taking his character a little too far, I thought. Kind of like George Bush thinking he really is the president. Now, most people think of the Fountain of Youth to just be this foolish Indian myth. I don't, I thought. Why else would they buy all those ads for minoxidil and Viagra and silicone breast implants? As for me, I keep my Viagra right next to my Prozac. But, you know, if either one of them worked, I really wouldn't need the other one. There seemed to be some sort of a language barrier, he explained, because the Calusa Indians were not talking about a fountain of youth that could melt away cellulite or prevent gingivitis. They were talking about the youth of the species, not the individual. It's why when the Spanish came here in search of decent Indian food, and also in search of fresh slaves, the free African sailors that came over with them started putting two and two together that hostile Indians who knew the territory better than they did didn't make such good slaves, and the Africans might become the very slaves the Spanish were in search of. So the Africans built a fort for their own protection, adjacent to the famous Spanish fort. Yes, the first blacks in America were not slaves, and the first American slaves were not black. And this is well before Plymouth Rock landed on the Indians. Mention that the next time you meet some Boston blue blood boasting of how long ago his ancestors on the Mayflower arrived here. And those African slaves I mentioned before knew this too, because they adopted Christian stories about crossing the river of eternal life, or at least crossing from slave territories into free ones. I find it kind of ironic that the mythology of their captors helped these slaves escape the mythology of their captors. As for the Seminole, they took these former slaves in, gave them room and board, gave them jobs in their casinos. The Indian cultures and the African cultures mixed. Together they invented menthol cigarettes. But let me tell you, when Colonel Sanders, who was settling just north of there, heard about free black people living in their own community, tried to put a stop to it, hired a guy by the name of Andrew Jackson. But Colonel Sanders' faithful family retainers, Uncle Ben and Aunt Jemima, teamed up with the Florida State Seminole, and Andrew Jackson was forced to surrender, while slinking back to Washington, D.C. to declare victory and later become president. It's not the only time that defeat in Florida has led to becoming president, but that's a different story. As for the Seminole, they remain unconquered to this day. Think about that the next time you go down to Hollywood, Florida, and feed one of those new green pictures of Andrew Jackson into a slot machine. Perhaps the casinos are the Indians' way of paying white people back for bringing them the 40-ouncer. I wondered why he hadn't mentioned that back at the tourist trap. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and bore you with all the details about the first slaves to be freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, or the first big race riot that eventually led to the end of segregation, all happening in St. Augustine, Florida. I'll just say that it happened. and that in the end, a man named after Martin Luther had a dream that eventually came true. Now, that's not to say that he was the only one that had that dream, or that the present is particularly auspicious. In fact, right now, there are far too many descendants of former slaves working minimum wage jobs, using the very water from the fountain of youth just to water the emerald lawns of the Ponce de Leon Golf and Conference Center. But it's a glass half empty, half full question, to which I say, get a smaller glass. There are millions of problems in this world, a million of them right here, right now. But that means there are a million answers, a million voices, and a million dreams. And every dream does come true. It's all in the way you interpret it. Ponce de Leon, too, had a dream. He just didn't interpret his dream the right way. His quest in the wrong pursuit wound up getting him killed about 100 miles south of St. Augustine. And 100 miles south of St. Augustine, in a place we know as Cape Canaveral, the roosters say it best. They begin crowing as roosters do. But the thing is, the dawn is not yet upon us. Yet the whole horizon blooms at once. A misty blue light fills our lungs as the horizon hurls yellow rage across the water's edge. Thousands of miles an hour, a blue-gray ribbon suddenly streaks towards the open arms of heaven. The sky rumbles. Canada geese honk across the water befuddled. And then a long trail of God's own cigar smoke is all that remains. It seems that the Hubble telescope was again in need of repair. Our pictures of the universe had become blurry, and the space shuttle was making a house call that morning, and 3 astronauts were deployed with a bottle of Windex to go clean its mirror. The infinite is smaller somehow. Yes, I said, get a smaller glass. But you know, if you think about it, from up there, when you look down on it, Florida itself might just look like this giant limp tallywhacker hanging flaccid from the beast now known as the United States. But if you really think about it, from that drooping Johnson, mankind ejaculates into the cosmos, shooting the seeds of the fountain of youth to swim the heavens in search of eternal creation. We have walked on the moon. Satellites do probe the galaxies. There is a fountain of youth that has nothing to do with minoxidil, Viagra, or silicone breast implants. And as I thought about that, the fountain of youth, not the silicone breast implants, I found myself drifting back into consciousness in a swimming pool in St. Augustine, Florida, held afloat by a life-sized inflatable alligator. My corona no longer ice cold, wondering, how do I interpret this dream?
My name is Ethelbert Miller. I'm the director of the African American Resource Center, and I'm also the guest curator of this exhibit, All the Stories Are True. The Anacostia Museum staff was kind enough to extend an invitation to me. I looked at this show as being a sort of brainstorming process that results in looking at African American writers in their workplace, looking at where stories come from. You can see with the panels is that I saw the exhibit as a book opening, these are pages of a book. So each person's section here represents a chapter. You know, that's how it flows. And I was very much concerned about where people were placed and how you would walk in. I wanted you to see, you know, Valerie Boyd and Hurston first. I wanted you to turn the corner and see, you know, Octavia Butler and Sarah Delany together and Myers and Greenfield. I wanted them to display that way because I felt there was a certain continuity. The writers in this exhibit are still living. Okay, this isn't an exhibit that we're looking at something that Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote. This is a living exhibit. And I think in this case what happens, you want to be able to celebrate writers that when somebody comes through the door, there's a discovery. I think many of us come through the door. We know Maya Angelou, we know Mary Baraka, we know Sonia Sanchez if we're reading a lot. And I think that for someone to come into the show and say, oh, this is Kenny Carroll, or this is Walter D. Myers, I think that that's a discovery that is good programming for the museum. I wouldn't want to be part of an exhibit that has a certain sameness, a same sound to it, the same taste. Danticat, I just think, is a fantastic writer. I think her most recent book, The Drugmakers, is just outstanding. I think some of the concepts that she's dealing with in terms of the whole thing of forgiveness is very important in terms of literature. She's also a person that I just think is extremely gracious. You know, I just love her. I feel that if you put her in a room with people, you come away saying, okay, this woman has touched my life. Or this is, if you're a young person, you say, okay, I want to be a writer like her.
I think a great story, first of all, captures a person's attention. You know, it just makes you stop your life for a second to enter this other space. I always look for that in the stories that I read, something that will just make me stop and hush and listen. That will just draw me out of my life, that will captivate me. So I think a great story has to be first enthralling, captivating, has to make you want to trade your everyday life. And then second, has to keep your attention, you know, has to keep you turning the pages or keep making you want to know what happens next. And then at the end, it has to have this sense that even though you're out of the story, it's still with you.
Eloise Greenfield is here because I think so many of us now have grown up on her work. There's been a strong emphasis on the importance of children's literature. You know, when we talk about the importance of literacy, and you know, those first books are very, very important. And Eloise Greenfield provides that. I wanted Eloise Greenfield and Walter D. Myers because I think that this exhibit is going to be one that's going to reach a lot of young people. You need a historical framework, and I think Valerie Boyd provides that with the Hurston. And we know, for example, those of us who are here in Washington, see that when you highlight Hurston, that's Washington history also, because she was a student at Howard University. And Charles Johnson is probably my closest literary friend. I probably stay in touch with him maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 times a day, even though he lives in Seattle. He's the person that we share a lot of our work together before it's published.
New Orleans wasn't home, it was heaven. But even paradise must have its backside too, and it is here, alas, that the newcomer comes to rest. Upstream there were waterfront saloons and dives, a black underworld of thieves, gamblers, and ne'er-do-wells who, unlike the Creoles downstream, they sniffed down their long continental noses at poor purebred Negroes like myself, didn't give a tinker's damn about my family tree and welcomed me as the world downstream would not. In plain English, I was a petty thief.
I also was excited when this exhibit opened. My first wife, Michelle, was here, and she was just tickled beyond, I mean, she was just so excited because she says, you know who's in here? Sam Delaney's in here. And I never forgot that, you know, and the importance of science fiction writing. And I always felt that over the last few years, Octavia Butler was getting a lot more attention than Samuel Delany. And being a literary activist, I always try to set the record straight. Butler's important, but here was Samuel Delany, and it's nice to see this exhibit put them side by side. Kenny Carroll, I think Kenny's here. I mean, there's a lot of local poets who are in Washington, but Kenny's not just writing poetry. He's also helping to organize young people in terms of developing their appreciation of literature. He's been very active in terms of Writers' Corps. He's been very active in terms of local slam. So I always see Kenny as a local treasure. We also have Dolores Kendricks in the exhibit. I like to refer to her as the First Lady of Poetry in Washington, D.C.
I'm traveling in my bones and the spirit swooshes out before I get a chance to say amen. Oh, the wind, the sea. I'm dead on this boat. Go away, nigga, they said. So I go, don't touch me yet, got to get home to my mother. Ain't that what the Lord said when he rise from the dead, going home to his mother? Won't somebody row this boat out of hell? Can't be no slave forever, not me and my children, all pretty and soft, all wet and they skin moist like the sea air they be burying me in. Can't be no slave forever. Make way, Lord, here I come, here I am.
She's a second poet laureate for our city. She comes after Sterling Brown. She's been doing a remarkable job in terms of the poet laureate office. Across the country, for example, you'll find a number of poet laureates in terms of cities and also states. I think that what Dolores has done here in Washington is provide the poet laureate position with a certain model. I mean, we were developing a poet laureate position for a place that didn't have it. We would look at what she's doing, sponsoring literary events, going out, making herself available. She also has gone in and created an office at the D.C. Arts Commission. She's also gone out and obtained funding, you know, for the poet laureate position. I think if a person comes to this exhibit, sees these authors, see the books that are under glass, see the books that are on the display table, hopefully they leave this exhibit wanting to read a book. I think when we look at literacy and its importance in the black community, that's something that has to be underscored, whether we're a school or whether we're a museum. So that's one thing. A second thing is that I would hope that this exhibit would encourage people to become writers. You know, this isn't 1950 where it's just like James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison and Gwendolyn Brooks. This is a time in which, you know, when you go to a bookstore or you go to a library, there are a lot of voices to choose from. And hopefully young people coming to this exhibit will see that their voice can be added to this rich tradition.
Welcome to Writer's Block at the Coffee House. Our guest is veteran journalist who has recently published his first novel, and which was named by Book Magazine as one of the 10 new writers to watch in 2003. A general assignment reporter in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, Christopher Marquis is now the author of A Hole in the Heart, a novel about becoming at once both lost and found, set largely in a small village in Alaska. Before joining the New York Times, Christopher Marquis was a longtime correspondent at the Miami Herald, where he covered Latin America. He began working on A Hole in the Heart while a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and I should add that he earned his way through the University of California at Berkeley by working, as does the main character in his novel, on the slime line at a cannery in Alaska during the summers. Welcome, Chris, to the Coffee House.
Thank you, Richard. It's good to be here.
Maybe we should start with Alaska, since it figures so prominently in the book. Here is a novel about, I think, very much loss and about how to cope with loss. Its main character, Bean Jessup, is a young school teacher who moves to Alaska. How does Alaska play a role in the novel as a character? The setting seems so important, and I wonder how you see its importance in relation to the novel's themes of loss and grief.
I worked in Alaska, as you mentioned, in college, and it struck me as a fascinating landscape, a perfect backdrop to set a novel because of the grandeur of the place. And yet, the fishing village where I decided to focus Bean's life is a small, almost small town, Mayberry-esque village, sort of perched in the middle of grand isolation. There's no roads in or out. You have to get there by boat or plane. And it struck me as just sort of a fascinating setting to really explore feelings of desolation, community, and rebuilding your life based on your own precepts.
It's interesting you compared it to Mayberry to start with and then came to the word desolation, of course, because I think we usually think of those as so different. We're told in the novel that Bean identifies or feels kinship, I think is the line, with the birds that come to Alaska. And each of the chapters in the novel begins with an excerpt from Pemberton's Guide to the Birds of Alaska. And I wondered how, in what ways does Bean feel kinship with the birds that come specifically to Alaska?
Bean's excuse me. Bean is a bit of a lost soul. She's estranged from her family. She's made a decision at a point in her life, she's 26 years old, to move to Alaska and try to define herself on her own terms. Up until then, she'd been largely dominated by a neglectful mother, an estranged father. This was her opportunity to decide who she was going to be as a person. And she migrated, in a sense, to Alaska to discover who she was. The birds of Alaska are fascinating, and it's one of the great nature preserves that we still have. And Bean was taken with sort of the long journeys that they undertake, the Arctic tern, which travels more, spends more time in daylight than any other creature, constantly flying toward the sun. Their homing instincts, their mating rituals, all of these things serve to guide her to figure out her own world. So she clung to the Pemberton Guide almost as a guide for life.
It's interesting because the novel sets up such a realistic surface of daily life in Alaska, Bean's eventual journey back to San Francisco with her mother-in-law after her husband dies. And yet at the same time, it's a metaphoric novel, as clear from listening to you talk about Pemberton's Guide. You use the word lost to describe Bean. And when Bean moves to Alaska and meets a man and marries a man who shortly goes missing, taking tourists up to Mount McKinley and is later found dead. When she meets this man, Mick, who's to become her husband, we're told that Bean feels saved, that she feels as if she's found. I'm thinking about that in terms of the word lost. And it strikes me as kind of an irony maybe in the novel, because while she's feeling that, her husband is about to go missing and not be found. And I wondered how you saw this metaphor of being lost and being found in the novel. Is it important for Bean to not feel saved, but to save herself?
Absolutely. And to my mind, life is a constant flux of being lost and being found. And that's sort of what the book is an exploration of, is the often unlikely bonds we make to get us through to the next hurdle, get us over the next hump. And that's what Bean does, is she establishes the first bond with Mick, her husband, and then when he's no longer there, she has to reach out to the community in which she's based herself. And that means the children that she teaches in school, that means her hard-sexed best friend, Lois, and ultimately that means her mother-in-law, with whom she chafes at first, but ultimately comes to probably the deepest relationship of the book.
In many ways, the most interesting character, the mother-in-law, Hannah, who comes to Alaska after her son is declared missing. I wondered often throughout the book, the title, the metaphor of the title, A Hole in the Heart, the idea of how we move around with holes in us and move nonetheless is important. Hannah is the one who gets to speak about that in the novel, who describes, if I remember correctly, describes a hole in the heart as being something that we all have, and that being something that we all learn to live with. How do you see her function in the book in terms of as a guide to being, as a teacher, I suppose, a chain-smoking, geriatric, unlikely teacher to being? Yeah.
She is the most unwelcome guest at first. She's 70-something years old. She's arthritic, so she's always dropping things. She's got a penchant for stealing. She's constantly snatching things and tucking them away, to Bean's unending irritation. So she's not exactly your classic role model. But she has learned a few things in life, one of which is, as you say, the realization that we all have holes in our hearts. We all have just searing losses that we carry around with us, and perhaps we don't ever overcome, but we learn to live with. And what she tells to Bean is, don't just endure those holes, but cherish them. Because at the end of the day, you want a heart full of holes. Think of them as a badge. What else are you going to have to show for your life?
She She's a very moving character in that way. It's interesting because she starts off, I suppose, not only as an unwelcome guest, but as an oddly comic character, and ends up as a source of wisdom. It's interesting to me, of course, also that she's the mother-in-law, and that Bean's relation with her own mother is strained would be too mild, is broken, and that so many families throughout A Hole in the Heart are biological families, are essentially splintered and broken and painful sources. What is the role of found family in the book as opposed to biological?
It's essential to the story. I think in this day and age, people are much more familiar with this concept that you can't pick your biological family, but you can craft your own found family. And that's exactly what Bean does. As you say, her relationship with her mother couldn't be much worse. Her mother is very meticulous and very concerned with appearances. And Bean is a little bit, she's a bit sloppy, she's a bit, her thinking process is not so rigorous, her thoughts float through her head like clothes in the dryer. She's a little late. She's the kind of person who, when she's washing clothes, she throws a red sock into the laundry and everything comes out pink. She's still getting her act together.
When you describe her right now, you describe her so much in terms of the images you use for the novel, and listening to you describe someone in terms of images, it's hard not to wonder, what does a novel let you do that as a journalist you cannot do? In your daily life, of course, I don't know that your work is telling a story by virtue of its images. What has the novel been like for you?
Not as much. It's been liberating, Richard. That's probably been the most exciting thing, is that I spend most of my days writing what other people say about the world. They're chronicling their vision of the world, their vision of reality. And it's a very exacting discipline for the newspaper. This was an opportunity for me to just fly off like one of the birds that I write about. It was a chance to really explore feelings and also just put my own self throughout the book. And one of the most exciting things about a first novel too is to just pull in all your life experiences, mix them up, and lay them out in a new and exciting way that sort of stuns yourself at that process.
It's a pleasure as a reader to be part of the mix, and thank you very much for the novel. Many thanks to Christopher Marquis for joining us in the Coffee House to discuss his debut novel, A Hole in the Heart. I'm Richard McCann, and this has been Writer's Block.
My grandmother had an old friend named Lillian Jenkins. When she unwound her silver bun, it hung way past her shoulder blades. I never understood why everyone disliked her so. She wore Jenklee bangles and gypsy scarves, took jazzercise at 90. Her house was a fire hazard of paperbacks. She gave me homemade couture Barbie dolls every Christmas until I was 16. Her husband, Joe, had died way before I was born. They'd had no children, so even though she made all the grown-ups' eyes roll, she was always invited to Thanksgiving dinner. My grandmother's holiday linen are all missing one napkin because every year after a third glass of wine, Lillian would slide a dinner roll under the table, split it with her thumbnail, and begin to build a sandwich of every dish on the table in her palm. She'd wrap it in the linen in her lap, then belligerently argue with whatever conversation was going on to distract while she stashed it in her purse, as if she didn't do it every year and no one knew. When Lillian died, she left me an ivory bangle she'd bought in Africa. It weighs down my hand gestures as I talk, so whenever I wear it, I keep that arm in my lap and smile to myself in wonder of loneliness and time's forbidden treasures.
there's no more halting now. Now you know my heart. So take my hand, we'll start out walking. With the sweet taste of waking, your smile on my lips. The sun winks and slips her way on tiptoe, tossing her dancing light through the leaves at your window. We throw off the blankets and night tucks her sand in the pockets of her moon rose, vanishing into the brightness. Open the gate, love, pull me spinning into the arms of a new day. Open the gate, ooh, give me some laughter, you're making up the way. Secret door, we crawl down through the floor. The tunnel twists, there's roots in the ceiling, frogs on the rocks, they point the direction because they can't talk. We're believing in symbols, forgetting the clocks, our feet quick and nimble, dancing out of the box. The dark makes me tremble, but we're giving off sparks. We stay safe as a thimble in our bright red socks. Oh, my darling, I'll give you clementines and ripened rhymes for breakfast. 'Cause I am yours and you are mine. You know, I think we'd better duck fast, 'cause the time flies buzz around our heads. Try to infect us with real life dread and deadlines. But I hope you're listening this time. Open the gate, love, I'll pull you spinning into the arms of a new day. Open the gate, ooh, shining brightly, discovering the way. Over pebbles to the lake, the small waves breaking. The water is warm to our waist to ease the aching. The day is kind and calm and waking, and you hold my hand here.
Welcome, Audrey. Welcome, Rick, to the coffee house.
Thank you very much.
This is the ping pong part of the interview, but the camera will take care of that. Only we know this is happening. You guys have been playing music together for quite a while as a duo. Mm-hmm. And how long have you been playing before Rick?
I started playing in about 8th grade. And,
okay.
And
but that was like basketball and field hockey?
Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
okay.
And folk music. And,
yeah.
And we've been playing together for about 4 years, and it's been great.
Audrey did a better job of actually, absorbing the folk tradition as a kid.
Right.
Whereas I was exposed to it, but was listening to Rush and Pink Floyd and all that.
But I had a lot of help because I had a neighbor who was French, and she used to play in the subways of Paris, and she came over and she said, "What do you mean you don't know any Bob Dylan?" I said, I haven't heard any. I know
so you
Kingston
had a French
Trio.
neighbor introduce you to
exactly.
American folk music, yeah.
Yeah, that would be, Huh. Now, at what point did you say, hey, you know what, we're okay individually, but together we got to perform as a duo? When was that moment?
I don't know when the moment was, but I'm really happy it happened because, I performed for probably about 4 or 5 years on my own, and I had a great time doing it, and I had a CD and all that, but it's so much better to perform with Audrey, to have harmony and to have better songwriting and to have the interaction that we have on stage and that sort of thing. It's
kind of
much more
lonely to
rewarding.
play by yourself,
yeah.
you know, and to actually have a partner who has a voice that can blend with yours and you know
Now,
similar tastes and everything.
Rick mentioned songwriting, and I think listeners out there, you know, inquiring minds, who writes the words most of the time? You know, who's Jagger, who's Richards? You know, who does the music? What happens there?
As a duo, we play a lot of our own songs, and we come in creating parts for the song. So if I have a song, then Rick will create a part for it. We've only co-written like 2 songs or so.
2 or 3, something like that. And generally I write the song and I bring it to Audrey and she throws it away and writes a new song inspired by the song I wrote.
Well, not completely. There was one time when we actually did the like division thing where he wrote the words and I wrote the music.
Like
so that
clearly,
was
Yeah, and that worked out
Is that
well.
song still in your repertoire?
Except that she wrote it in such a way that I couldn't play it, though. That was the other problem.
Put it in a range you couldn't sing, or chords you hadn't yet.
Chords, I have no idea what her fingers do on that song.
All right, what was that song that you just played?
That was Open the Gate.
Okay, which was good for opening the set. That was the segue. What are you going to take us out with?
A song that Rick wrote.
Yeah, it's actually it was written because last year, that is the year of 2003, on Valentine's Day, which I thought was just one of these Hallmark holidays. And we have this great relationship, so who needs Valentine's Day, right?
You've told me this story.
Yeah, and so in the end, I realized when Audrey went off to the store to buy some day-old chocolates that maybe that was a hint, and
She said something like, "Oh, you don't need to get me anything."
But she didn't mean it.
No. I think I said a card might be nice,
Yeah,
but you kind of want to make yourself seem very low maintenance.
Yeah,
really.
It was early in the relationship.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, during the course of the time when she went out to the store to get the day-old chocolate, I said, "I'll have a surprise for you when you come back." And,
cool.
And indeed, I did.
And it wasn't like I changed the kitty litter.
No, it was Mother Necessity sitting at my side saying, "Write this down."
And you'll take us out with that.
Yes, I will.
Even though we don't know when the show will be on the air, it's that Valentine's.
It doesn't
song.
matter. It's a
universal.
song. It's a rock and roll song for the over 30 crowd. Not the teeny bopper.
No.
It's the true love, everyday love song. So.
Take it away.
All right, I need to change instruments here. Are you ready? I'm gonna take you out, I'm gonna hold your hand, I'm gonna rub your feet, I'm gonna be your man, I'm gonna be there with you for the rest of my life. I'm gonna shovel your driveway, gonna split your logs, I'm gonna fly your kite, I'm gonna walk your dogs, I'm gonna be there with you for the rest of my life. It ain't all kisses, honeymoon wishes, and baby, I'm here to stay. Romance is fine, I'll be your Valentine, but true love happens every day, every day. I'm gonna draw your bath, I'm gonna wash your hair, I'm gonna sort the socks and fold the underwear. Gonna be so tidy for the rest of my life. I'm gonna save my money, gonna buy this house, maybe build another cabinet and catch that little mouse. I'll be your handyman for the rest of my life. It ain't all kisses, honeymoon wishes, and baby, I'm here to stay. Romance is fine, I'll be your Valentine, but true love happens every day, every day. I'm gonna join the church and take the kids to school. I'm gonna pack their lunches, make up some rules. I'll be your family man for the rest of my life. I'm gonna join the neighbors for a potluck dinner. Gonna play some cards, I'm gonna be the winner, 'cause I'll be your partner for the rest of my life. It It ain't all kisses, honeymoon wishes, and baby, I'm here to stay. Romance is fine, I'll be your Valentine, but true love happens every day, every day. It ain't all kisses, honeymoon wishes, and baby, I'm here to stay. Romance is fine, I'll be your Valentine, but true love happens every day, every day. True love happens 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 every day.